In a luxurious restaurant, where executives often decide the fate of millions during silent lunches, an international meeting seemed to be heading perfectly toward the signing of a historic contract. Among powerful businessmen, lawyers, and foreign investors, no one noticed that something extremely dangerous was hidden in the words circulating around the table, until a simple waitress, considered invisible by everyone there, began to notice details that no one else saw. At the exact moment the Millionaire CEO's pen was about to touch the paper, she took courage and said something that made the entire room freeze. Before discovering how a single sentence changed the fate of an entire company, subscribe to the channel and prepare to hear a surprising story about courage, intelligence, and the power of speaking the truth at the right time. The rain arrived without warning that Tuesday morning, pouring down on the asphalt of Bibi with an intensity that seemed to want to wash away even the memory of the sidewalks. The marquees of the corporate buildings dripped streams of water like transparent curtains, and the executives arriving by car for their morning appointments ran across the distance between the vehicle and the revolving door, with briefcases held over their heads. It was the kind of morning where São Paulo showed its harshest face, grey and indifferent, the city functioning at the same frenetic pace as always, completely ignoring the storm. On the third floor of one of the most imposing buildings on the avenue, the restaurant Terrace Noir occupied a space that seemed to have been built specifically to impress. The main hall had a laminated glass ceiling that now received the rain with a soft drumming, and the dark marble tables reflected the golden light of the recessed lamps. Every detail had been thought out to communicate one single thing: power. Those who lunched there didn't need to say who they were. The environment said it for them. Terrace Noir was the kind of place where silence is expensive. There was no background music on corporate meeting days, only the contained murmur of conversations, the discreet clinking of glasses, and the almost imperceptible sound of heels on the polished granite floors. Bottles of water were brought to the table without anyone asking. The coffee arrived at the right temperature. The employees knew that their greatest quality was being exactly as invisible as the clients needed them to be. Renata Cavalcante arrived 50 minutes before opening, as she did every Tuesday and Thursday. She entered through the service door in the back, stored her umbrella in the narrow locker in the dressing room, and changed her worn sneakers for the pair of black non-slip-soled shoes she kept in a plastic bag inside her backpack. It was a ritual as incorporated into her routine as drinking coffee at 6 in the morning before taking 2 buses to the university. The college was on the other side of the city, and Wednesday and Friday classes started early. But today was Tuesday, and Tuesday was a day to work. She was 26 years old and carried on her shoulders a determination that the most inattentive might confuse with stubbornness. The daughter of a hairdresser from Ipiranga and a driver retired due to back problems, Renata had passed the entrance exams for 2 public universities and chosen the letters course with a qualification in translation and international relations, at the time not having a very clear idea of how that would translate into a job. What she knew was that languages had always felt like a second skin to her. English she had learned on her own with television series and a dictionary borrowed from the neighborhood library. The process had taken years and passed through all possible phases of self-teaching: the initial euphoria, the plateaus of stagnation, the moments when she repeated phrases in a low voice inside her room to feel the pronunciation in her own body. French came through a volunteer teacher from the state school, who gave optional classes on Fridays, a woman named Vera who had never been to France, but who taught the language with a passion that compensated for any limitation of experience. Spanish arrived almost naturally, through proximity to Portuguese and the television her mother left on for Colombian soap operas on Sunday nights. German she had started at the university and could already maintain a reasonable conversation, even if with some effort in the moments when technical vocabulary came into play. Working at Terrace Noir had been an achievement that took 3 interviews and a week of unpaid training. The salary wasn't extraordinary, but the tips from the executives could be generous when the mood was good, and the environment, although demanding, was organized. Renata knew exactly which table preferred which sparkling mineral water, who drank coffee without sugar as soon as they sat down, and who needed the bread service to be presented in absolute silence. She had developed an almost invisible ability to be present without being noticed, to circulate through the hall as if she were part of the furniture, capturing everything around her with an attention that wasn't trained. It was natural. That morning, the manager Soraya called her before the collective briefing with the team. Soraya was a middle-aged woman, with her hair always tied back and a voice that rarely rose in volume. But when it did, it froze any employee in place. She held a clipboard and spoke with her usual objectivity. The private room would be reserved for a high-level meeting starting at 11 o'clock. Renata would be responsible for the exclusive service of the table for the entire duration of the event. There was a national businessman, Eduardo Moraes, and a foreign delegation composed of 3 representatives from an investment fund based in Zurich. The meeting would deal with a technological partnership agreement. Total discretion, redoubled attention, and any need of those present should be met without them needing to ask twice. Renata mentally noted every detail. She knew that being assigned to the private room was a form of trust from management. It wasn't for just any employee. She went to get the glasses and begin the mise en place with the same methodical calm as always. While organizing the utensils, she heard 2 colleagues commenting behind the scenes about Eduardo Moraes. It was a known name among the restaurant staff because he frequented the space regularly. The founder of a company for artificial intelligence solutions applied to the logistics sector. He had built his fortune over 15 years with a combination of technical vision and an appetite for risk. He was the kind of man who entered a room and made the environment gravitate toward him, not out of arrogance, but through a kind of concentrated energy that he projected without apparent effort. At 10:40, Renata finished the preparation of the private room. The table was impeccable. The rain outside still persisted, but the glass ceiling filtered the noise, transforming it into a distant whisper. She stood still for a moment, looking at the empty hall, feeling without knowing exactly why that this afternoon would not be ordinary. It was one of those perceptions without form, without apparent reason, a kind of light pressure in the air that she wouldn't know how to describe if someone asked. But that was there with all the consistency of an intuition she had learned not to dismiss. When she returned to the kitchen to get the first tray of sparkling water, she was no longer thinking about it. There was work to be done. At 11:10, Eduardo Moraes arrived with a man by his side whom she recognized as being his private translator, a fellow in expensive suits and impeccable posture named Enrique Salles. He had been there other times, always beside the businessman in meetings with foreign investors. Renata had served him before. He was a man of controlled gestures and a smile that she had never been able to call genuine, but that worked with precision within the environments in which he circulated. The foreign representatives arrived shortly after, 3 people, 2 women and 1 man, with accents that she identified immediately. The older woman spoke English with a Swiss-German inflection. The man next to her had French as his first language. That was evident by the rhythm of the phrases and the way he paused before prepositions. And the third representative alternated between English and German, with a fluency that indicated natural bilingualism, without the hesitation of someone who is translating internally before speaking. Renata served water, smiled discreetly, and retreated to her waiting position. The meeting began. And for a good while everything seemed absolutely normal. The meeting proceeded through the first 20 minutes with the predictable cadence of any high-level negotiation. Documents were presented, graphs were explained, numbers were cited. The foreign delegation spoke with technical precision, and Enrique Salles translated with a resourcefulness that seemed to confirm every cent of what he must charge for his services. Eduardo Moraes listened attentively, made notes in a dark leather-covered planner, and occasionally raised his hand to ask for additional clarification. Renata circulated through the hall at the right pace. She collected empty glasses before the silence at the table, asked for a refill, changed napkins with almost imperceptible movements, checked the water temperature. It was the kind of presence that disappears precisely because it functions perfectly. No one looked at her. No one needed to look. But she looked at them. It wasn't an intentional observation, at least not at the beginning. It was just the habit that the work itself had developed in her over the months at Terrace Noire. To be attentive, to anticipate, to understand what the table needed before someone verbalized it, and as part of that habit she listened, not to eavesdrop on the content of the conversations, but to calibrate the mood, tone of voice, rhythm, tension or lightness in the air. It was through this path that the first inconsistencies reached her. The older representative, whom Renata began to call mentally Mrs. Gruber, after the surname she had heard mentioned in the initial introduction, explained for a few minutes a set of clauses related to the delivery schedule for the first phases of the project. She was meticulous. She used specific expressions in English that left no room for interpretation. Fixed deadlines, progressive penalties for delay, and a maximum tolerance window of 15 calendar days before financial compensation mechanisms were automatically activated. Renata wasn't trying to translate what she heard. She was just existing in the environment when she noticed, almost like a discordant noise in a familiar song, that the Portuguese version delivered by Henrique Salles had a completely different weight. He had conveyed the general idea, yes, but he softened the deadlines, transformed the penalties into something that sounded like predictable adjustments, and completely eliminated the expression maximum tolerance window, which in the original speech carried an urgency that was not present in the translation. Renata stood still for a second next to the side table where she rested the tray. Then she moved again, naturally. It might have been style, she thought. Some translators prefer to adapt the tone so as not to create unnecessary anxiety in negotiations. She had learned this in college. Translation is not word-for-word substitution. There are choices, there are judgments. But the seed had been planted. In the following minutes, she paid attention in a different way. Still discreet, still doing her job with the same precision as always, but with a part of her consciousness dedicated to following what was said and what was repeated, like two simultaneous sound frequencies that she tried to keep separate. The French representative, a man named Leblanc, whose surname had appeared on the document spread across the table, began to detail a structure for participation in the technological results developed during the partnership. It was a long and technical explanation, and he used French at some moments, which Renata understood without difficulty. The central point was clear. Any innovation generated within the contract period would have co-authorship recognized by the investing fund, which in practice meant shared access to the intellectual property resulting from the collaboration. Henrique translated this for Eduardo as a standard model of co-development widely adopted in the sector, without major implications for the autonomy of the national company. Renata placed a new bottle of water on the table with a calculated lightness. Her face showed nothing, but inside something had solidified. That wasn't a translation style. That was distortion. The difference between co-development with implications for autonomy and standard model without major implications was the difference between a conscious decision and a blind signature. And she knew this not because she was a lawyer or an expert in international contracts, but because she had spent the last 4 years studying exactly how words change weight, depending on the context in which they are placed. The problem was that she was a waitress in that hall, and the man sitting at the table was one of the most influential businessmen in the Brazilian technology sector. And the translator who was lying to him was a professional who likely charged considerable figures for his services, and who had years of established relationship with Eduardo Moraes. She discreetly left the hall to get a new tray of bread service in the kitchen. Inside, the noise of the environment received her like a reality shock. The sous-chef shouted instructions, pans clattered, someone had dropped a sauce container and was being reprimanded in a low but furious voice. The normal life of the restaurant followed its course, completely oblivious to what was happening a few meters away. Renata stood still for a few seconds with her hands resting on the edge of the stainless steel counter. She looked at the wall ahead without really seeing anything. What should she do with that? The simplest answer, and also the safest for herself, was to do nothing. Continue serving. Continue being invisible. After all, she could be wrong. She could be misinterpreting some technical nuance that she didn't completely master. It could be that Henrique Salles knew things about that negotiation that she didn't know, contexts that justified the adaptations he was making. And even if that weren't the case, intervening in a meeting of that level could cost her job in a matter of minutes. Soraya would not tolerate an employee who disturbed a client of Eduardo Moraes' stature. And without this job, the portion of the rent she paid alone would be uncovered. The tickets for the 2 buses to the university would need to be recalculated in the budget, and the plan to finish the course without delaying another semester would go up in smoke. She took a deep breath, picked up the tray and returned to the hall. The meeting had advanced. The documents were being reorganized on the table, and Eduardo Morais was already flipping through the final pages of the contract. The translator spoke in a low, relaxed tone, like someone guiding someone through the last steps of a path already traveled many times. And then the third representative, the bilingual woman who alternated English and German, said something in a firm voice that made Renata stop in the middle of the hall, as if the floor had changed consistency under her feet. The phrase had been said in German, and the meaning was unmistakable. There was a clause in Annex 4 that provided for the automatic transfer of certain software licenses to the investing fund's portfolio at the end of the 3rd year of the contract, regardless of the renewal or non-renewal of the partnership. Automatic transfer, regardless of renewal. Renata stood watching Enrique Salles translate that as a technical provision regarding the registration of joint patents, subject to periodic review. And it was at that moment that she knew, with a certainty that needed no more evidence, that there was no way to stay quiet. She dried her hands on her apron, adjusted the position of the tray and returned to the hall with measured steps. The bread service reached the table at the right time. The glasses were refilled without anyone asking. On the outside, it was an afternoon like any other at Terrace Noire. On the inside, there was a decision taking shape with the slow and irrevocable precision of something that can no longer be undone. Taking a decision is different from executing it. Renata knew this with a clarity that came from within, not from reasoning. She had decided to act, but acting meant taking a step that could not be undone, and the weight of that made her hesitate for a few more minutes, while the meeting continued around her like a gear that didn't know it was about to be interrupted. Eduardo Morais had the contract in his hands. His prescription lenses reflected the golden light of the hall as he scanned the pages with that concentrated attention Renata had observed all morning. He was a man who clearly didn't sign anything without reading. But reading wasn't enough when what was written did not correspond to what had been said, and when the explanations that underpinned his reading had been built on distorted versions of reality. Enrique Salles was relaxed. This detail did not escape Renata. He had crossed his hands over the table with the lightness of someone who already knows how the story ends. He smiled at the right times, tilted his head slightly when Eduardo asked questions, and delivered answers that always sounded reassuring. It was a performance, and a good one. The foreign representatives, in turn, waited with the professional composure of those accustomed to this type of waiting. Mrs. Gruber checked something on her tablet discreetly. Leblanc talked in a low voice with the third representative, whom Renata had identified by her badge as being Dr. Anke Bremer. The conversation between the two was in French and revolved around flight logistics, not the contract. They were already mentally at the next appointment. Renata placed the tray on the side table with excessive care, as if the act of making noise at that moment could break her own resolve. Then she slowly approached the main table. She had spent the last 3 minutes mentally rehearsing the first words, not the whole speech, just the first ones, because she knew that if she could manage to start, the rest would come. It was like the first meter of a long race. The difficulty wasn't in the distance, it was in the start. "Excuse me, Mr. Morais." The voice came out firmer than she expected. Eduardo raised his eyes from the contract with an expression of slight annoyance. Beside him, Enrique Salles turned his face to her with the look of someone who couldn't imagine that a waitress could have anything relevant to add to that table. She didn't look at Enrique. She maintained eye contact with Eduardo. "I need to say something important." Eduardo Morais placed the contract on the table. There was something in her posture, in the absence of excessive apologies, in the direct way she had spoken, that made him not interrupt her immediately. It was the kind of presence that imposes itself not by volume, but by precision. "You may continue," he said, with a neutrality that could mean anything between controlled irritation and genuine curiosity. Renata breathed once. "Your translator is not correctly conveying the content of this meeting." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but they were 3 seconds of a density, that made the air in the hall seem different. Henrique Salles was the first to react. He rose slightly in his chair with a smile that tried to be condescending, but could not hide a tension that had appeared in the corner of his eyes. "This is completely absurd," he said, addressing Eduardo. "She is a restaurant employee. She has no qualification to evaluate the work of a certified translation professional." Eduardo did not respond to Henrique. He continued looking at Renata. "Do you speak the languages used in this meeting?" She did not hesitate. English, French, and German. Dr. Bremer used all three languages during the meeting. I understood everything. Eduardo was silent for a moment. Then he turned his gaze to Dr. Bremer and asked in English directly, without an intermediary, "What did you say about Annex 4? Anke Bremer raised her eyebrows slightly, like someone who didn't expect to be questioned in this way. She responded in English with objectivity. "I said that there is a clause for the automatic transfer of software licenses at the end of the third year of the contract, regardless of renewal." Eduardo turned to Henrique. "You translated that as a periodic review of joint patents." Henrique opened his mouth, closed it, and then adopted a tone that tried to sound like a pedagogical clarification. "There are technical nuances that need to be adapted to preserve the clarity of the negotiation. My translation captured the general sense in a manner appropriate for the context." "The general sense," Eduardo repeated in a low voice, as if he were testing the weight of each word. Renata stayed in place. She didn't retreat, didn't apologize, didn't add anything that hadn't been asked. She had said what needed to be said. The rest no longer depended on her. "Please, sit down," Eduardo said to her, indicating an empty chair near the wall. "Not as an employee, as someone I need to be here." She obeyed without comment. What followed was one of the tensest hours that Terrace Noire had witnessed in years. Eduardo Moraes asked that each central point of the meeting be represented by the foreign representatives, and Renata translated in real time. Her voice was uniform and technical, without dramatic inflection, without an attempt to influence. She translated what she heard with the precision of someone who had spent years learning that fidelity to the content was the only real commitment of a translator. The differences that appeared throughout the review were serious enough that Eduardo Moraes' expression gradually closed, not out of immediate anger, but from that kind of cold concentration that men accustomed to managing crises develop as a survival mechanism. Henrique Salles tried to intervene twice. The first time, Eduardo asked him to wait. The second time, he asked him to remain silent. When the review reached the clause in Annex 4, Renata translated Dr. Bremer's entire sentence word for word, including the part about independence from renewal. Eduardo reread the annex carefully. Then he closed the contract. "This meeting is suspended," he said in a tone that admitted no discussion. The foreign representatives exchanged looks. Mrs. Gruber said something in English that Renata translated without Eduardo needing to ask. "She says they understand the need for review and that they are available to resume when you are ready." Eduardo nodded once. Then he looked at Henrique Salles with an expression that Renata couldn't classify as anger, disappointment, or simply the clinical record of an inevitable conclusion. "We need to talk, but not here." Henrique collected his documents without saying anything. His composure had completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked like a combination of calculation and forced restraint. He left the hall without looking at Renata. When the door closed, Eduardo remained still for a few seconds. Then he turned his gaze back to her, who was still sitting in the chair by the wall, with her hands crossed in her lap, and an expression that tried not to reveal how much her legs were shaking under the table. "What is your name?" he asked. "Renata Cavalcante." He nodded slowly, like someone filing away information he knows he will need later. "Thank you, Renata." She didn't respond. She only did what the restaurant training had taught. She tilted her head slightly, stood up carefully, and returned to her position by the side table. Outside, the rain had stopped. The glass ceiling of the private room now let in a grey but clear light, and the reflection of the lamps on the marble surfaces seemed sharper than before, as if the environment itself knew that something had changed. Renata began to collect the glasses with that same silent precision as always. But she knew, with a certainty that grew every second, that the day had not yet ended. Her own reflection passed through the glass of the window for a fraction of a second as she moved back to the side table, a girl in a simple uniform in a marble hall. The image lasted less than a second, but she carried it with her back to work, not as a memory of where she was, but as confirmation that she was exactly where she needed to be. The news spread through Terrace Noire with the silent speed that only the backstages of a restaurant can achieve. No one had heard anything directly because the walls of the private room were thick and discretion was an irrevocable rule of the house. But the movement was different. The fact that the meeting had been interrupted before lunch, that one of the guests had left alone with an expression that the maitre would later describe as closed, and that Soraya had been called urgently to the private room right after, composed a picture that Renata's colleagues knew how to read even without words. Renata was in the kitchen when Soraya found her. The manager came with quick steps and an expression that Renata couldn't immediately decipher, that combination of seriousness that could lean toward either recognition or dismissal. She prepared herself internally for either one. "Mr. Moraes wants to speak with you before he leaves. Go to the private room now." It wasn't a question. Renata took off her apron, smoothed her hands over her uniform blouse, and walked down the hallway that led to the hall with the same calm she used for any task. Inside, however, there was a dull noise she recognized as being the physical variation of nervousness. Her heart slightly accelerated, her jaw a bit more clenched than usual. Eduardo Moraes was alone when she entered. The documents had been put away. The table was almost as she had found it in the morning, except for the glasses still on the surface and the napkin he had folded and refolded while waiting, a detail she noticed unintentionally. He stood up when she entered, which surprised her. "You can sit," he said, indicating the chair in front of him. She sat. He did too. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He observed her with that concentrated attention she had noticed throughout the meeting, the same kind of look he used for documents, not of suspicion, but of reading. "How long have you worked here?" he asked finally. "Almost 2 years. And do you study?" "Letters with a qualification in translation and international relations, public university. I'm in my 4th year." Eduardo nodded slowly. "Where did you learn German?" "In college. I have 2 years of formal courses, but I already spoke reasonable English and French before entering." He was silent for a few seconds, as if he were calibrating something internally. "What you heard today would cost me much more than I know how to calculate right now, not just financially." Renata didn't respond. There was a sobriety in him that didn't need an immediate response, so she waited. "I have worked with Henrique Sales for 6 years, he continued. "I traveled with him to Geneva, to Frankfurt, to Dubai. I never had a reason to question what he translated, and that was exactly what he counted on." She recognized the weight of that statement. It wasn't anger. It was the slow reconstruction of an entire memory, 6 years of meetings being reread under a different light. It was the kind of discovery that doesn't make noise, but that reorganizes everything underneath. "How you knew you were risking your job by speaking," Eduardo said, not as a question. "Yes." "And even so, you spoke?" "Yes." "Why?" Renata thought before responding. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to find the exact words. Because there were people whose work depended on what you would sign. And because lying with languages is the worst form of lie I know. You use someone's trust in what they don't understand to build a trap with words that the victim themselves cannot see. Eduardo stared at her for a moment longer than the previous ones. Then he said, "My lawyers are already reviewing the contract, and I'm going to need someone I can call for situations like this while the investigation into Henrique proceeds. I'm not offering a position right now. I'm asking for your availability." Renata felt the weight of those words with a calm that surprised even herself. There was no euphoria. There was only the recognition that something had moved. "I have classes Wednesday and Friday mornings," she replied, "and I work here Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday." He sketched something that was almost a smile. "We can work with that." They didn't sign anything that day. There was no formal proposal, nor a service provision contract. Just a phone number written on the back of a business card, and a handshake that, for Renata, had a weight that no document could reproduce. When she left the private room and returned to the hallway, Soraya was waiting outside. The manager looked at her with an expression that this time Renata could read clearly. It was respect. Not the effusive and verbal kind, but the discreet and solid kind that manifests in a direct look and a slight nod of the head. The rest of the shift passed with an almost surreal normality. Renata served lunches, collected plates, refilled water and coffee, responded politely to the requests of the clients in the main hall, and said nothing about what had happened. There was nothing to say yet. It was too early to fully understand where that could lead. But in the afternoon, when the movement decreased and she left through the service door with her backpack on her shoulder, the sun had returned. The wet sidewalk still reflected the car lights, and the air had that specific smell of after the rain in São Paulo, a mixture of damp earth and hot asphalt that she had known since childhood. She walked to the bus stop and stood waiting with her hands in her pockets. She thought about what she had done. She thought about the people who worked at Eduardo Moraes' company, and who would never know that a waitress on the third floor of a restaurant had interfered on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in what could have been an irreversible turnaround. She thought about the years of study she had carried out without knowing exactly where they pointed. And she thought about Henrique Salles, who at that moment was likely already constructing his version of the facts. The bus arrived with a squeal of brakes, and she boarded without haste. She took the seat by the window and looked at the city passing by outside. The buildings, the billboards, the people crossing the street at the limit of the red light. There was a message on her cell phone. It was from a number she didn't know, just one line. "Thank you again. See you soon. EM." She put the cell phone in her pocket and looked back at the window. But what she still didn't know was that the investigation that had been initiated that afternoon would reveal something much larger than a series of incorrect translations. There was an entire structure behind it, and a piece that no one had noticed yet except for her, without knowing that she had noticed it. The number was saved in her contacts with just the initials EM. It was a small detail, but she had learned that small details say a lot about how people want things to be. He hadn't asked for formal treatment nor established distance. He had left the path open, and Renata, who had spent her whole life learning to read what wasn't written, understood the message without needing it to be explained. Taking a decision is one thing. Carrying the weight of it in the following days is something completely different. Renata spent the night from Tuesday to Wednesday with an agitation that wasn't exactly anxiety, but wasn't tranquility either. It was the intermediate state of someone who had done something irreversible, and who was still processing what that meant in concrete terms for her own life. She had told the truth. In a room full of influential executives, she had interfered in a negotiation that did not formally concern her, and she had, perhaps, permanently altered the trajectory of a company whose employees would never know she existed. All this by her own initiative, at a moment when the safest and most rational choice would have been to continue serving sparkling water and collecting dirty napkins. 5 days later, Renata received a call at 8 in the morning while waiting for the coffee to heat up on the electric hot plate in the kitchen of the apartment she shared with a college friend in Ipiranga. The friend had left early for an internship, and the apartment had the specific silence of mornings when one is alone in a space that is normally shared. The number was the same as the one on the business card Eduardo had given her on Tuesday afternoon. Eduardo Moraes' voice was objective and fast, without the protocol of someone calling for the first time. The lawyers finished the contract review this morning. The potential loss was in the range of 42 million reais between penalties, loss of revenue due to forced exclusivity, and the issue of the licenses. Would you be available for a meeting tomorrow afternoon? Renata had class in the morning and a shift at the restaurant on Thursday. She mentally reorganized her schedule, calculated the feasibility, and said yes. The meeting took place on the 23rd floor of a building on Faria Lima, at the headquarters of Eduardo's company. The meeting room had glass walls with a view of a horizon of buildings that got lost as far as the pollution allowed one to see. There was coffee, water, a long table, and 4 people besides Eduardo, 2 lawyers, a corporate advisor named Deborah, who was introduced as responsible for international contract management, and a quiet man in the corner who was briefly mentioned as an external consultant. Renata observed the environment without comment. It was a different world from the one she knew, but not a world that intimidated her. Different worlds were exactly what she had spent years studying how to cross. The meeting was long and technical. The lawyers presented the critical points of the contract, accompanied by the transcriptions of the original speeches of the foreign representatives, who had voluntarily provided an audio recording of the meeting as part of the verification process. It was standard practice for their fund to document all negotiations, and the fact that they made the material available had been interpreted by Eduardo's lawyers as a sign that the foreign group had also been harmed by the situation, or at least was genuinely interested in rebuilding trust. Renata listened to excerpts of the audio and confirmed point by point where Enrique Sales's translations had diverged from the original content. The lawyers took notes. Eduardo observed. There was a precision in that process that she recognized from other contexts. It was exactly like a technical translation review. Verify the original, verify the version produced, identify where the meaning had been displaced and in which direction. At the end of the meeting, when the others were already gathering their papers, Eduardo asked her to stay. Deborah stayed too. "I'm going to make a formal proposal," Eduardo said. "It's not final yet. There are details to work out. But I want you to know now because I want you to think carefully before responding." Renata waited. "I want to hire you as a multilingual communication support consultant for meetings with international partners. I'm not asking you to quit college. On the contrary, the agreement includes a supplementary scholarship to cover whatever you need in the remaining semesters. The workload would be adapted to your academic calendar. You would work in person when necessary and remotely the rest of the time." Deborah opened a folder and slid a sheet across the table. It was a preliminary proposal with the general terms. Renata looked at the paper. She saw the numbers. She didn't let her face change. On the inside, that was the equivalent of 4 months of what she earned at the restaurant combined, per month. It was the difference between calculating if there would be money for the bus fare at the end of the month and not needing to calculate. It was the difference between a budget that depended on unforeseen events not happening and one that allowed unforeseen events to happen without everything collapsing. "I need a few days to think," she said. "Of course," Eduardo replied. "No pressure." She left the room, crossed the glass-walled hallway and took the elevator alone. In the elevator mirror, she saw a girl with a backpack on her shoulder and a folded sheet in a hand that was shaking slightly. She folded the sheet with more care and put it in her backpack. On the subway back home, she didn't open her cell phone. She kept looking at the darkness of the tunnel with that specific sensation of when life takes such a sharp turn that the body takes time to keep up with the head. That same night, she went to her parents' house in Ipiranga. She hadn't told them anything yet. Her mother had the television on a soap opera, and her father was sleeping in the armchair with the newspaper open in his lap. It was the most normal image in the world, and Renata stood in the doorway of the living room for a second, feeling the contrast between that and the 23rd floor of Faria Lima with a view of the entire city. She sat next to her mother and was silent for a while. "Did something happen?" her mother asked without taking her eyes off the soap opera. "It did," Renata responded, "but I'm still understanding what it was." Her mother turned off the television volume. That was the language between them. Volume off meant total attention. Renata told everything, from the rain on Tuesday morning to the elevator that afternoon. Her mother listened without interrupting, with that patience she had learned in the years of listening to clients tell their lives while waiting for the hair dye to take. When she finished, they were silent for a moment. "You were afraid of losing your job and you spoke anyway," the mother said finally. "I was." "And you didn't lose it?" "No." The mother stared at her for an instant, with an expression Renata knew well. It was the look of when words would be insufficient, and silence is more honest. "Then accept it," she said simply. Renata left later that night, with a clarity she hadn't been able to find alone. There was something in that advice that was more than wisdom. It was permission. The permission to believe that what had happened was not luck disguised as coincidence, but the concrete result of years of work that had found the right moment to manifest. The next morning she called Eduardo Moraes and said she accepted. But what no one knew yet, not Renata, not the lawyers, not Eduardo, was that Enrique Sales had not acted alone. and that the person who had orchestrated the scheme from the inside was much closer than anyone could imagine at that moment. The investigation was still in its infancy, and some answers would only emerge when the right questions were asked by someone who knew exactly what they were hearing. The first weeks at the company were a rapid immersion into a world Renata knew from books, but had never inhabited up close. She didn't have a fixed desk. She worked in a shared space on the corporate floor, usually with the laptop she had bought in installments the previous year, participating in preparatory meetings and reviewing documents in English, French, and German before they reached Eduardo's desk. It was work that required constant precision and a contextual memory she was developing quickly, because each contract carried references to previous agreements, and each new clause had a story that needed to be understood to be correctly interpreted. Deborah was the one who guided her in the early days, and Renata was grateful for that. The advisor was efficient, direct, and had no patience for beating around the bush, which matched well with how Renata preferred to work. There was a cordiality between them that grew as mutual respect was established. Not friendship yet, but the functional trust of two people who recognize each other's competence. The investigation into Henrique Sales ran in parallel, conducted by the legal department with the support of an external firm specialized in commercial disputes. Renata knew it existed, but she hadn't been involved directly. Her role there was different, or at least that was what everyone assumed, until the afternoon when Deborah called her to review a series of old emails exchanged between Henrique and intermediaries of the Swiss fund. The lawyers needed confirmation of the tone and vocabulary in some messages written in French and German. They were formal communications, full of technical references, and the external firm had requested a native second opinion on the exact meaning of certain expressions that could have distinct legal implications depending on the interpretation. Renata settled into a smaller room with the printed emails and began to work. It was dense material. 3 years of messages distributed in chronological order, and she read them with the methodical attention she had developed at the university during legal translation courses, line by line, context by context. Most confirmed what had already been identified by the lawyers. Henrique had acted as an intermediary, influencing Eduardo's positioning in negotiations through manipulated translations to benefit third parties who would receive hidden commissions when the contracts were closed under conditions favorable to the fund. But there was something more. Buried in the middle of an exchange of messages from 18 months ago, in an email written in German and apparently routine about travel logistics, there was a reference that the lawyers had not marked because they likely hadn't understood it as significant. The phrase in question was a response from Henrique to someone identified only by the initials DF, saying that the procedure was being managed in alignment with the expectations of the internal consultant and that the internal consultant's position guaranteed access to preparatory documents before the meetings, which made the process considerably more efficient. Internal consultant. Renata reread the phrase 3 times. Then she went back to the beginning of the email to check the date. 18 months ago, 3 months before one of the company's largest rounds of negotiation, which had been mentioned in hallway conversations as an agreement that had fallen short of expectations. Without the reasons being widely disclosed, she didn't say anything immediately. She copied the phrase, noted the date and the context, and continued the work until the end. She delivered the review report to Deborah with the points marked and the technical observations that had been requested. The phrase about the internal consultant was included, highlighted without additional interpretation. Just the precise translation and a note saying that the expression used in the original suggested an internal agent with privileged access, and that legal interpretation was beyond her scope. Deborah read the report that afternoon. She was silent for a few seconds with her eyes fixed on that specific line. Then she closed the folder and said she would take it to the lawyers. Renata went back to the shared space and opened her laptop. She had a preparatory meeting to review for the next day. She did the work with the same concentration as always. But at night, already at home, sitting on her bed with her notebook open, she went back to that phrase. Internal consultant with access to preparatory documents. Someone inside the company had fed Henrique with strategic information before the meetings, making the manipulations more precise and harder to detect. It wasn't just a translator who had acted on his own. It was a structure with two ends, and the internal end had not yet been identified. DF. She thought of the people she had met since she started working there, of the faces, the names, the roles. There was no one with those initials she had encountered directly. But there was something she had observed in those weeks, and that hadn't fit into any context until now. In the office, there was a man who rarely participated in meetings, but who was frequently in the hallways. He had been mentioned by Deborah in one of the first orientations as Daniel Fonseca, an external strategic consultant who had worked with the company for several years on a non-exclusive basis. Renata had crossed paths with him a few times without there being a reason for more substantial contact. DF. She closed the notebook. She knew it was an inference. A sequence of initials could correspond to dozens of names. It could be a coincidence. It could be someone external to Brazil. It could be anything. But she had learned in that restaurant hall on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that there were moments when the difference between acting and not acting was smaller than the distance between a chair and a table. The next day she arrived earlier. Before opening her laptop, she went to the administrative archives room with a simple pretext. She needed the contact of a supplier mentioned in a document she had reviewed. The archive receptionist saw no problem in that. Renata spent 20 minutes inside. When she came out, she had only the contact she had requested, and a date she had seen by accident, or at least that's what it would seem to anyone who had observed her. It was the date of the first contract signed between Daniel Fonseca and Eduardo Moraes' company, 2 years before the email with the initials, and 5 months before the first international negotiation in which Henrique Salles had acted as translator. The sequence was too precise to be ignored. She left the archive with her usual calm step. No one had paid attention to her. It was the same invisibility as in the marble hall, but this time she had chosen to use it as a tool. She had entered, found what she needed, and left without leaving a trace of curiosity or urgency. It was a clean movement, and the sequence of dates she carried in her memory was solid enough to hold the weight of what she was about to build around her. Renata spent 2 days organizing what she had found before taking it to anyone. It was a habit she had developed in college during technical translation assignments. Never present a hypothesis without first checking if it stood on its own, without depending on the enthusiasm of the person presenting it. Feelings of certainty are treacherous. Facts arranged with clarity have a different weight. She put together a simple document. Not a formal report because she wasn't a lawyer and didn't have the authority to produce one. It was a timeline. Date of the first contract of Fonseca with the company. Date of the first contract of Henrique Salles as a translator. Date of the first international negotiations in which the two had acted in parallel. Date of the German email with the reference to the internal consultant. Date of the meeting that had been interrupted at Terrace Noir. Each item occupied a line. Next to each date, an objective sentence explaining the source of the information. No adjectives, no explicit conclusions. Just the facts arranged in sequence so that anyone could follow the reasoning on their own. When she finished, she reread the document 3 times. On the 3rd time there was a feeling of firmness in her stomach that she recognized. It was the same as when a translation was finished, and she knew, before any external review, that it was correct. It was the specific clarity of when a text makes sense at all its levels at the same time. Vocabulary, syntax, context, purpose. She took the document to Deborah. The advisor read in silence. Renata stood on the other side of the desk, with her hands on the edge of the chair she hadn't been invited to occupy. There was no urgency. There was only the weight of someone who delivered something and waits for the weight to be recognized. When Deborah finished reading, she stood still for a moment with the paper in her hand. Then she looked at Renata with an expression that wasn't exactly surprise. It was something closer to the sobriety of someone who just had a suspicion confirmed that they preferred not to be true. "Did you speak with anyone before bringing this to me?" "No." Deborah folded the paper carefully and said she would need to take it directly to Eduardo. That very afternoon. The meeting took place at the end of the day, when the office had mostly emptied. Eduardo, Deborah, the 2 lawyers, and Renata. She presented the timeline orally, following what she had written, without deviating without inflating. The lawyers asked technical questions about the origin of each item. She responded with precision, indicating the documents from which each datum had been extracted. Eduardo listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a time that seemed longer than it was. "Do you know Daniel Fonseca personally?" he asked finally. "I've crossed paths with him a few times in the hallways. We've never had a substantive conversation." He nodded. "Daniel has worked with me for 7 years. He has been present in practically every major strategic decision I've made in that period." No one in the room spoke for a few seconds. It was the kind of information that had implications reaching far beyond a poorly signed contract. 7 years of strategic decisions reviewed under the light of an undeclared collaboration with someone who had manipulated the translations of international negotiations was a territory the lawyers would need to map carefully, and that Eduardo would need to process with an energy that went beyond the professional. Renata said nothing. It was the moment when her role had been fulfilled, and she had enough awareness to recognize that. The lawyers requested immediate access to all contracts and communications in which Fonseca had been an involved party in the last 3 years. Eduardo authorized it. The meeting was adjourned with the tense objectivity of an action plan that hadn't found all its pieces yet, but needed to start moving. Renata left the office that night with a different exhaustion than the others. It wasn't physical tiredness. It was the kind of tiredness that comes from carrying something heavy that has finally been deposited in the right place. The next day, Daniel Fonseca did not appear at the office. The justification sent by email was an external schedule. The lawyers had already begun the documentary survey without him knowing. During that week, Renata continued her regular work. She reviewed documents, participated in preparatory meetings, helped correct an automated translation that had introduced serious conceptual errors in a contract with a Spanish partner. The routine had a consistency that she valued, especially in the moments when things around were uncertain. There was something stabilizing in doing a concrete thing well while larger questions remained open. It was the same logic as studying for an exam when personal life is confused. Precise work functions as an anchor, but there was something that disturbed her concentration in the moments of less movement. A question she hadn't yet been able to answer completely. Henrique Sales had acted as the executor. Daniel Fonseca had acted as the internal facilitator, but who had initiated the scheme? Who had identified the negotiations as an opportunity and built the structure around them? Who was the mind that had designed the functioning of everything before the other two entered the scene? She thought about this during the subway trip on Thursday night, and it was at that moment, with the noise of the tracks covering the sound of the city outside, that a detail that had remained at the edge of her attention for days finally found the place where it fit. In the German emails she had reviewed, there was a lateral reference to a market analysis document that had been sent to Henrique as support material before the first round of negotiations with the Swiss fund. The document had been described as a proprietary analysis produced by a consultant with specific expertise in the European investment sector. It wasn't Daniel Fonseca. The initials on the analysis document were different, and when she went back mentally to the original email, she realized she had passed by that reference without marking it because it seemed like just a context detail. But now, with everything that had accumulated since then, that detail had a completely different outline. It was the kind of element that changes nature when the field around it changes, invisible in one context, fundamental in another. There was a third person, and that person had not yet been identified by anyone. She got off at the station after the one she intended out of distraction. She walked back around the block in the cool of the night without getting irritated about it. Sometimes detours are necessary. Sometimes the longest path is the only one that allows you to see what the direct path erases. Back at home, she opened her notebook and wrote a single line. Third person, market analysis, initials not identified. Then she closed the notebook. There was work for the next day, and she needed the hours of sleep to be precise. Imprecision, she had learned, was the opposite of courage. It was just carelessness with consequences. Sleeping, however, took longer than planned. There was a low urgency pulsing beneath her thoughts, not of anxiety, but of anticipation. Like when you know an answer is close, and the brain insists on working even after the rest of the body has asked for rest. She lay listening to the noise of the street outside, the night buses passing spaced out, the dog of some neighbor barking once and stopping, and let the thoughts come and go without trying to organize them. Sometimes understanding arrives from below, not from the front. The market analysis document had been sent as an attachment in an email from 2 years ago. Renata knew that the original files must still be in the company's internal system, because the lawyers had requested a total preservation of all digital records since the start of the investigation. She requested access to the specific file through the legal department, justifying the request as a review of multilingual material already identified in the audit. The authorization came the next day. The document was extensive, 64 pages of analysis on the European Technology Investment Fund market, with a specific focus on the sector of artificial intelligence applied to logistics. The level of detail was impressive, and the language was that of someone with a solid technical background and access to market information that wasn't public. There were data that could only have come from inside previous negotiations, from confidential presentations, from closed meetings. The document was written in English. In the footer of each page, there was a discrete line with the initials of the author, PV. Renata stared at those 2 letters for a long moment. Then she opened the company's internal contact system, which was accessible to all collaborators, and did a simple search. The result appeared in seconds. There was only one person in the company's records with those initials, Paula Vasconcelos, an independent consultant, specialist in international expansion strategy, hired by the company 2.5 years ago for a project to map foreign markets. Her contractual link had been formally ended 18 months prior, 3 months after the first round of negotiations with the Swiss fund. Renata read the profile twice. Then she closed the system and sat in silence in the review room with the printed document in her hand. Paula Vasconcelos had produced the analysis that gave Enrique Sales the technical arsenal necessary to build the distortions with surgical precision. She had mapped exactly what Eduardo would need to hear to accept the conditions, where his tolerance for risk lay, which aspects of the agreement would be prioritized. With this material, Enrique knew exactly which parts of the negotiation to soften and which to omit, so that the businessman would sign, convinced that he had closed a good deal. It was a sophisticated architecture. 3 people with distinct roles, Paula Vasconcelos as the strategist, Daniel Fonseca as the facilitator with internal access, and Enrique Sales as the executor in the meetings. Each maintained a sufficient distance from the others so that, if one were discovered, the link with the others would not be immediate. What had broken the scheme was not an investigation. It was a waitress who understood German. Renata took the document and her notes to Deborah, with her usual objectivity. The advisor read, was silent, and this time said only, "I'm going to call Eduardo now." The meeting that followed was different from the previous ones. Eduardo was present, the 2 lawyers, Deborah. And this time there was also a person from the corporate security department whom Renata hadn't seen before. She presented what she had found with the same linear clarity as the other times. At the end, there was silence. Eduardo stood still for a time that seemed long. Then he asked with a voice that had neither anger nor indignation, just that cold sobriety Renata had learned to identify as the mode in which he processed things that were both clear and difficult. "Do you know what you're saying? That the person who mapped my company from the inside to facilitate all this was someone I myself hired, and who spent 1.5 years with access to documents that should not have left here?" "Yes," Renata responded. "And you reached this from a document footer." "From initials in a footer," she corrected, which coincided with a name that was in the company's records. Eduardo closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was an expression she hadn't seen in him before. It wasn't exactly vulnerability, but it was something adjacent to it. The expression of someone who had built something for 15 years and who was realizing at that moment that part of what he had built had been inhabited by people who used his trust as an instrument. "Thank you," he said. Again, and for the 3rd time. The lawyers took over the rest. Paula Vasconcelos would be contacted formally through legal channels. Daniel Fonseca had been notified the previous afternoon, and the link was being terminated with the applicable contractual clauses. Enrique Sales had already been informed that he would face a lawsuit for breach of contract and undue use of confidential information. None of them would go to prison for that, at least not directly for what had happened with Eduardo's company. But the professional and legal consequences would be serious enough to end the careers they had built based on the trust of others. Renata left the office that afternoon with the same backpack as always. On the subway, there were more people than usual because of an event downtown that had shifted the rush hour. She stood, holding the plastic handle over her head, swaying slightly with the movement of the tracks. She thought of Paula Vasconcelos, who had spent a year and a half inside that office building a map of Eduardo's trust, only to later use it against him from a distance. She thought of Daniel Fonseca, who had maintained 7 years of close presence while opening doors from the inside. She thought of Enrique Sales, who had transformed the art of language into an instrument of systematic manipulation. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her by its absence of bitterness that all three had bet on the invisibility of people who were not like them. On the waitress who served water and didn't speak. On the restaurant employee who was there for the bread service and not for the contract. They had bet wrong. The subway stopped at the Ipiranga station. She got off, went up the escalator, and came out on the street with the late afternoon sun hitting the building facades from the side. She had a translation assignment to turn in on Friday. She had a shift at the restaurant on Saturday because she had asked to maintain the link until the end of the semester as a matter of commitment to Soraya, who had accepted with her usual discretion. And she had a meeting with a new German partner scheduled for the following Monday, the first in which she would act as the primary person responsible for multilingual communication. It was a life that still fit in an old backpack, but it had gained in a few weeks an amplitude that she was still learning to inhabit. She walked toward home with her usual regular step, and for the first time in a long time, without the feeling that destiny was a thing that happened to other people. And that was how that story ended. Not with an explosion, but with the specific sound of a door opening to a hallway she was still learning to walk down. Without fanfare, without a speech, with the same regular step with which she had always crossed the places where others did not see her. 3 months after that rainy Tuesday morning in Itaim Bibi, Terrace Noir continued to function with the same discreet elegance as always. The golden lamps still reflected on the dark marble tables, the glass ceiling still received the rain when it arrived, and the executives still closed million-dollar contracts during sophisticated lunches without paying attention to the employees circulating around them. Renata still went there sometimes, not to work but because Soraya had become a kind of reference she didn't want to lose sight of, and because the restaurant had a connection with the moment when everything had changed that she wasn't ready to simply abandon in her memory. On the Monday following that afternoon, when she had found the initials in the document footer, she had conducted the meeting with the German partner with a competence that had left Eduardo Moraes visibly satisfied and the legal team relieved. The partner had praised the clarity of the communication. No one in the room knew that 6 weeks earlier she was serving coffee on the floor below. The deal with the Swiss fund was resumed months later, with a new representation team, and with all clauses reviewed and translated in a transparent manner. The investing group, which had voluntarily provided the audio of the original meeting as a sign of good faith, had shown itself to be a legitimate partnership from the start, the target of the scheme, not its author. The new version of the contract was more balanced, with realistic deadlines and clearly distributed responsibilities. Renata had not signed anything as part of that deal, but she had participated in every stage of the linguistic review, and there was a clause in the final contract that she knew by heart because she had been the one to translate it for Eduardo, word for the first time. Daniel Fonseca had ended all his links with the São Paulo corporate market. Paula Vasconcelos was responding to a lawsuit for undue use of confidential information. Enrique Sales had lost his professional certifications as part of the extrajudicial settlements. None of the three had disappeared from the city, but their names had ceased to circulate in the environments where they were previously respected. Renata had graduated at the end of that semester, with a 1-week delay because of an assignment that needed to be redone. But she had graduated. Her mother had taken a photo of the diploma in the university hallway with a pride that dispensed with words, and her father had stayed awake later than usual that night, for no apparent reason except to be present. She worked now full-time at Eduardo Moraes' company. She had a desk with a window that faced the internal hallway, not the city, but it was a window. She had a magnetic access card that opened the turnstiles on the 23rd floor, and she had, on her desk, next to the laptop that was still the same one from before, a pen that Eduardo had left there without saying anything, the same pen that had been in his hand in that private room on the day he didn't sign the contract. She had never asked if it had been intentional, and he had never explained. Some stories don't need all the words to be complete. What Renata had learned in those months, between the marble hall and the glass-walled office, between the old backpack and the magnetic card, was a simple thing that no resume can teach. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to act with precision exactly when fear is at its loudest. She had served water and coffee while listening to what no one expected she could understand. She had spoken when it was easier to stay quiet. She had followed every thread to the end, not out of ambition, but because there was an internal coherence in it that did not allow her to stop in the middle. And that, in the end, had been enough. The city outside remained the same. The buildings, the buses, the traffic lights, the wet sidewalks after the rain. But there is a huge difference between crossing a city without knowing where one is going and crossing it, knowing that the path was built with one's own hands. Renata knew that now. And when the next email with a contract in German arrived in her inbox at 8:40 that morning, she opened it, read the first line with that attention that was her particular signature, and began to work. Dear audience, we hope that Renata Cavalcante's story has touched something true in you. She started at a marble table serving sparkling water and ended up on the other side of the table, building agreements that are worth decades. But what never changed was the clarity with which she listened, the courage with which she spoke, and the precision with which she acted. If this story stayed with you, if it generated some feeling or thought that you want to share, the comments below are the right space for that. Tell us what you felt. Tell us if you have ever gone through a moment when you needed to speak, when it was easier to stay quiet. These stories exist to connect, and the most genuine connection begins when you let your voice appear as well. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Every week we bring new stories like this, stories of ordinary people who found something extraordinary within themselves at the right moment. Leave your like so that more people can find this content and come back for the next story. We are here waiting for you. End of story. There is a phrase Renata heard in one of her first translation classes at the university that never completely left her head. To translate is to inhabit two worlds at the same time without belonging completely to either. She had understood that as a limitation when she was a student. Over time, she understood it as an advantage. Those who inhabit two worlds at the same time see what those in a single world cannot: the gaps, the contradictions, what was not said but was implicit. What was said but means something else. It was exactly that which she had done in that marble hall. Not a special heroism, not an out-of-the-ordinary intelligence, just the consistent application of a skill built over years of study and a character that had decided in a moment of real tension that the truth was worth more than immediate security. And sometimes that's it. Sometimes that's all it is.